That's very different than, if you'll notice, the normal theme song. I added a section there. Now that's the Funky Friday theme. This is the Funky Friday on the 28th of October. And this is the first part of a music series I'm going to do. I should add a rather, at least I think it is, rather unconventional music series, as you'll see soon. But anyhow, this Slow Passages is from my second Hard Listening album, Volume 2. It's the B section of a piece called Pop Cadence. And so, you know, it leads me to travel, do some time travel, and go back in time, because that music is something I did. I did that in 2015, and this is what this coffee stain here and this little sheet music is. A quintet that I've written, and it's sort of a big piece. It has, you know, I'm looking for an ensemble to do it. It doesn't matter. It could be college or university level or anybody. I really would love, if you have a string quartet, know a string quartet, are in a string quartet, and don't mind me, because there's a piano part, me going in there and doing stuff. Mind my little intrusions there, musical intrusions, sensitive intrusions, but still. I think, you know, I'll get back to this in a bit. I don't want to get too far ahead of anything, but so I'm going to do today. You know, I've been watching a lot of music videos, you know, how-to instructional videos and things like that. And I've been watching them over the years. You know, I've been watching them, I think, since they've been in existence. Online platform, and I'm thinking, well, I want to do my own kind of thing, which is very different, will be very different, as I said, idiosyncratic, because I'm going to talk about my personal life and talk a little bit about how I came to do what you just heard me do on piano. Like, where does it come from? Why this musical language and not some other musical language? So we have to go back actually to my infancy, because I was born an only child into a family of two parents, and my two parents started to this day completely unprecedented, sui generis, unique cosmetic manufacturing company that was organic and all the rest of it. And they were starting. So the year I was born was 1967. The year of Sergeant Pepper, many other big things happened in 1967. And, you know, as a toddler, and then I think age 1, 2, 3, I did not have access to things really outside of the family business, by which I mean I was fairly isolated, geographically isolated, was certainly isolated from people. I didn't have any neighbors. You know, had I grown up in, say, Detroit, or Chicago, there would have been a musical community in the 60s and 70s. Maybe somebody would have a band or something like that. If it was there, either in Tampa, Florida, which is where I was, or in Manhattan, which is where I spent my summers in the 70s, actually. We'll get to that in a bit. I was just totally isolated, but all I had were LPs, albums, records. And the thing about it is that I really think my musical education, serious education, began with those albums, and I'm gonna talk a little bit about that now, because, you know, for those of you young people, there used to be these big things that carried music called records, and I should say that I should say a lot of things about it. So I've saved a few of them from those early 70s years, not a lot of them, but I'm going to talk about the uniqueness of my experience is sometimes in life, every one of us, you, me, everybody here, has unique things about them, and has actually things that they can contribute, accomplishments, things they're skilled at. But all of us have limitations, and sometimes they're quite powerful, or things that just we don't experience certain things that other people experience. And so I am not a prodigy. I'm a musician, but so many musicians are prodigies. And it's sort of story after story after story, all the greats, all the known names. You look at their biographies, they start piano at age 4 or 5. And they're prodigies of one kind or another. And I was not. Actually, I had many weaknesses. Music was one of the hardest things. It's the thing I love the most, more than anything in the world, practically. It's up there. But I was not a fast learner. I was a slow learner. And I had so one liability I had was ears. My ears weren't as strong as other people. And I learned this, there's a story about how I learned about this. So I had all these records and, no musical instruments, no bands, no choir, choruses, any of that. But I'm listening, and the albums I'm listening to are sort of like, they were mostly jazz, but there were also some radio plays and some symphonies and things like that. And so these are a few of those records. Now, this is classical music. This is Beethoven, Toscanini, and this is one of my dad's records from the late 40s. I think this is 49 NBC Radio Orchestra. And so I have this out here because it's very different than some of the other stuff I'm going to talk about. Also because it's like one of the older LPs here. And the thing about it is Toscanini's Beethoven's Ninth. I would listen to it, and so because my brain was developing, well, everything was developing. Certainly my heart, as they say, my heart, my soul, my spirit, body developing. Since I didn't have any access to any musical instruments, my substitution was listening to these records, and I would listen to them almost as if I was trying to figure out what was going on to the best of my ability. And I would crawl, and I would study the grooves in the records, like the LPs, and I could tell by the groove formations, like the without reading. Although I could already read, I read earlier than other people. That was the strength, was reading. I could look at the grooves and say, that groove is and real popular was Sgt. Pepper came out that year, and I listened to Sgt. Pepper religiously. I listened to Guys and Dolls religiously, the original. So when I say Guys and Dolls, I mean the original production with Robert Alda. Alan Alda's father, I think, was in that, and Stubby Kaye, and the people, Vivian Blanc. And because we're talking here late 60s, early 70s, 69, 70, 71. And I would lay on my back and I would just receive this music. And, some of the music really spoke to me more than other music. And, when I started becoming a boy, walking and things like that, still no musical instrument, still no real access to actual musicians. Occasionally, great musicians would come to town, and I would go with my family to see them. I saw some really incredible concerts. What comes to mind? Well, I saw a Jackson 5 concert in 1972 at Madison Square Garden, and that was very, very powerful experience. And I saw some classical things, but it was really these what's called jazz musicians. It's really their recordings that I really responded to. And so what I'm doing is I'm not able to play anything, and I'm putting on these albums and listening to these albums of largely instrumental music. And I thought I'd cue up some things here because I just wanted to kind of give you a sense of what I'm talking about. Now, when you're 6, 7, 8 years old, you're going to listen the way you're going to listen. And I'm sure every 6, 7, 8-year-old is different in how they listen to music, if in fact they do listen to music. I made a little playlist for today, believe it or not. And, I would get money for Christmas and that kind of thing, a very small amount. And I would go to Peaches Records and Tapes. These are some of the stores: Peaches, Record Hunter in New York, Sam Goody's, you go in, and I would pick out something that interested me. It was always something I read about because as a boy, I started subscribing to 2 magazines, Downbeat magazine, 3 magazines actually, Downbeat, Contemporary Keyboard. And this is all before I ever played an instrument. So I was already subscribing to a keyboard magazine, fantasizing about one day will I touch a piano. And so I'm listening to this, and I also subscribe to American Film, which is the American Film Institute. I actually brought, this is one of my early copies. It's of American Film Magazine. So I would open up this, this is 1980, and read about something called independent cinema, this new thing, and read about different, you would have an interview with, oh goodness, Mark Rappaport is in here. There's a discussion of, the budgeting of making an independent, yeah, they made movies their way, this kind of stuff, Hester Street, Joan Micklin Silver's Hester Street. And I would read these. Now you have to understand, I'm reading American Film Magazine, but in many cases I was not able to see some of these movies. I saw a lot of movies as a little kid, but I never really got to see some of the things they were talking about because some of the things they were talking about were so obscure and was so low budget and had such poor distribution that I would only read about it, and I would fantasize about what would that movie look like. I'm reading this review. This music is a little bit more direct than the movie because I'm actually hearing the music, although it's a recording. And so I heard this. I became fascinated by these 2 people, Herbie Hancock and Chick Corea, and they made this album of just 2 pianos. Now, here's the very first jazz I heard. I'm going to play it now. It happened to be Miles Davis. But it was not Kind of Blue. It was not Bertha the Cool. It was not Decoy or Man with the Horn or Sketches of Spain. It was his score for Louis Malle. It was this. You see, there's Jean Moreau. So my dad had this little Fontana record. It was about this size. And I sort of figured out how to play this record. I would put it on the turntable. And this is I think one of the so that's kind of a roundabout, circuitous way of hearing about Miles Davis. It's not constructed or scheduled by a canonical interpretation of Miles Davis, by which I mean, it's not, and then a lot of things we'll get to, because when you're a child and you're going to the record store, in that case, it's whatever the records are around, and it might be something that's very, that the record store decided to have in stock, inventory, right? And in the case of this album, my dad was listening to this, and I guess as a man in the 50s, right? He had this. And it just happened to be in the house. Same with the Beethoven, the Toscanini Ninth Symphony. And so you're kind of a little bit at the mercy of the environment, actually. You're at the mercy of what's available. You're at the mercy of the fact there are no musical instruments around you. And you fantasize about what would it be like to play a musical instrument. And I lay in my back and listen to this music, like, what would it be like to play that? So I started piano lessons rather late. I started at age 9 and 10, not 4 or 5. And, we'll get to that in a second, but, a few years later, I heard, I talked about, the Herbie Hancock and Chick Corea, and I sort of heard this. It's, I hope the sound is. I can't play all of that. I mean, I can't play. I'm playing little snippets to try to give you a sense of what I was experiencing. Now, this was a long concert that they did, recording Columbia Records. Now, in their career at this time, I had heard them live a little bit after this, both of them playing electronic music. I'd never heard them play only acoustic piano like this, like in a concert hall, until this record. And this was simply extraordinary. I didn't even know. And the other thing, too, is that when I got this album, I listened to it over and over and over again. It was the year I started piano lessons. And so I had a very strict, old school, old world Italian piano teacher named Violetta Mendesi. And I would ride my bicycle over to her house in the late 70s, and study these very simple exercises and these little pieces. And so this is after I got my upright. Now this piano here is the second piano I ever owned. And I got this one in 1979. And I was reunited with it, as I've said before, 3 years ago, after being away from it for a lot of my adult life. It was just because of, parental divorce and things and family and geography and, and so it's great to be reunited with it. But, the thing of it is, I would hear this album, and I would attempt to sit down at the piano, and I would attempt, well, what the heck was that? And I would be like, they would play. I would hear again. I'm 9 years old, so that's actually what it is. I mean, well, I wasn't able to do that. So I actually literally wasn't hearing what I was hearing. Wasn't able to reproduce it on the piano. To make matters worse, I actually met other gifted musicians my age when I would go to these camps. About a few years later, 80, 81, I would meet kids. I want to call them cats, but because this is what we call, cats that had absolute or perfect pitch. Get this, my strict Italian piano teacher, no jazz, no pop, classical. We're studying Clementi, Bach, these little pieces, songs from childhood by Schumann. And I thought, there's these scores, there's little sheet music scores, we're going to look at a score. And I thought, I can't reproduce what I'm hearing because my ears aren't there. I love this music. That music I just played you, I thought was the most beautiful music I've ever heard in my life. And I thought that a piano doing something like that was the most beautiful thing a piano can do in this earthly life. And so I thought, wow, I don't know it yet, but you know what I do know? I know the sheet music. And so I figured, what have I got to lose? I'm just going to follow my teacher. I'm just going to follow Violetta Mendesi. And I'm going to go and she's going to take her ruler and put the ruler on my hand, and all this kind of finger position and all this kind of stuff, this kind of very, and I figured, I'm learning these pieces and, I'm doing fairly well with them. I'm learning to interpret music, but it's all based on the score. And so I lived a dual life. I lived a life where I was being very dutiful and learning this very wonderful classical music. I did not love it as much as the other stuff I played earlier. But I certainly liked it, and I certainly respected it, and I figured it was something I could do. That's the thing in life. When you figure you could do something, you should pursue what you can do, and then maybe if you work on the things that you can't do, maybe one day you can do them. I kind of put it that way. Well, but in any event, I'm learning these pieces. I'm also starting to enter these little contests in Tampa, and these little, God, there's so many. They give you these little strange. Here's Mr. Beethoven. This is from the 70s. They give you this certificate that you learn this Beethoven thing, so I don't know. But so I'm listening to this music at home, and so I'm studying the sheet music, studying the scores, and I'm thinking, well, what am I going to do? I don't know. Always in the back of my mind, I'm like, I want to learn how to play this improvised music. I want to learn how to play it, at least to a degree of competence, sort of like what I was listening to. I never discussed it with anybody really then. I didn't really talk about it, but I did listen to it. I did go to these concerts. One day I said, Violetta Mendiza, you're always giving me these operas. She was an opera buff, and she would say, Mitch, you need to learn Tosca. You need to learn Aida. And so she would send me home with these huge box records, and I would put them on the back of my bicycle, go home and learn about Italian opera. And that's a whole other, I was actually quite busy, and I was a fairly atypical kid. If I'm going home on a bicycle from my piano lesson to listen to opera, because I need to learn about Rigoletto and, and Aida and things. And she would demonstrate and her cousin used to cook spaghetti after lessons, and it's just a whole, it's you had to be there, right? So but Violetta Mendizi said, Mitch, your pitch is okay, but you don't have perfect pitch or absolute pitch. I have perfect pitch. I didn't know what that was, actually. And so perfect pitch is the thing I was talking about earlier, of the kids that the jazz players that were ahead of everybody else were the kids who could hear something and play it. Keith Jarrett is that way. He can hear something and play it. There was I watched a wonderful video of a hip hop producer, and he was talking to Bob James, and Bob James said, Bob James, you and I have something in common. We both have perfect pitch. And I thought, well, that's interesting. Now, I'm thinking out loud now. This is interesting. So I said, we started to have like a cultural exchange like the Soviet Union and the United States. In the old days, but the Cold War, before this world, the Soviet Union and the U.S. would trade ballet companies and music, and we would send them Dizzy Gillespie, and we would send them Herbie Hancock and Chick Corea, and they would send the Bolshoi Ballet. Cultural exchange, that's right. And I said, Miss Mendizi, can I do a cultural exchange? I want to bring something in. It's called Sarah Vaughan and Oscar Peterson. Do you know who these people are? She didn't really know much about them. So I brought it. I brought in this, man. This is what I was listening to. Where are we? Yeah. Uh-oh. What happened here? This song.
I've got the world on a string. I'm sitting on a rainbow. Got a string around my finger. What a world, what a life. I'm in love. I got a song that I sing. I can make the rainbow.
She would keep these records as long as I would keep her records. But I think we eventually returned everything, to each other. When I put this song on, Violetta Mendiza says, scoot over. she starts doing this. And then gets to the solo. She starts playing Oscar Peterson's Lawns. Classical, 60-year-old classical Italian. From her ears, what she's hearing. She's never heard it before. And I'm sitting there, Mandisi, how do you know what he's doing? She says, oh, that's just this chord change and this chord change, and almost like an accomplished jazz performer. Because of her ears, she just could directly one of those people at perfect pitch. Now, she didn't swing very well. Her feeling wasn't great. You know, I was a little stiff, you know. It's a kind of I don't know, the way classical cats play that kind of music is sometimes very downbeat heavy and kind of a little bit stiff. But she knew all those lines, and I asked her, you know, what's going on there harmonically? And of course she had studied theory and musicology and all this stuff, so she would start talking about, well, I don't really know, I just sort of hear it. She was a choir director, and so that was a very intimate experience of the power of perfect pitch. Now, perfect pitch might be a curse. I have no idea. Like, I don't know. Here's the thing. I had this long 20-year journey, 10, 20, age 30, different music schools, going to Conservatory of Music, New England, solfeggio class. Solfege is a thing where you have to read pitches and sing these these pitches, and it's like a kind of an ear training thing. And that was a hard class for me. But you know what I did? I said, I'm going to master this ear thing. Larry Scripp is a teacher, great teacher. He said, you need to find any music you want, and you need to transcribe that music, and we're going to solfege it. And so I chose Wynton Kelly's solo from Miles Davis, Kind of Blue, Freddie Freeloader. I said, let's solfege that. And I got the whole class to go. That Freddie Freeloader, you know. And so it's funny to have this whole class and, you know, everybody doing, I can't sing, I didn't sing it. And I got an A on that. It was like, it really, learning that solo, very simple. And you write it down, you learn the solo, simple solo, it's not as complex as some of the earlier stuff I was listening to. Really gave my ears, I guess you would say my ears a quantum leap forward. And I thought, well, I understand Wynton Kelly. At that time, I was starting to play with a jazz group in Boston. And we were doing gigs, and I was like 18, 19, around town, playing night after night. And also, you know, playing, you know, some charts, complex things. And I'm actually developing my sound as a musician. So I'm actually finally doing what I wanted to do, this kind of music. And I'm getting better at it. Because when I was that little kid, not knowing what things are, I thought, baby steps. So if it's a blues like that, or if it's this, I Got the World on the String, we're in A flat. It's got to go somewhere. This is gonna stay on F flat. You can go if you wanted to. But of stuff. I was starting to get ideas. This would have been 1987, 88. In 89, I meet this guy. Okay, here's the thing. I had heard him as a little kid when he came to Tampa. In fact, I had the album here. Here he is. Yeah, this is him. And see, he had him sign my record. So that would have been, in the 70s. And here it is. You're in the Conservatory of Music in 1987. And Ralph DeLugoff says, we need to get a new piano teacher. He had connections. He's like, he actually was telling the school what piano teacher to get. Let's get Stanley Cowan here. In all arts, it's great to have a mentor. It's great to have somebody. It's like an apprenticeship thing. And that person becomes your master or your teacher of a sorts. And I'm to this day, I'm still learning things from him. And actually, this is what's really interesting. He got me really interested in the piano as an orchestra and the piano as a complete instrument. And I was preparing for my senior recital, and he got me excited about the piano as a solo instrument. And at the time, I was playing with groups. I was playing with drummers and bassists, horns and trombones and all this kind of stuff. And he said, well, what about? This is what Stanley Cowell told me the first day of lesson. He said, if you could play any piece of music, song, complete solo piano, he said, first, then you can learn everything about that song. And then after that, he said, then you can do things with that song and change it. You can make it yours. And then you could, create your own music. He says, but it all starts from this. And it starts from if we're in A flat. Which they call stride, and here's the thing. Stanley Cowell studied with Art Tatum. Art Tatum was a neighbor of his in Toledo, Ohio. That's where it comes from. And now he was teaching me. And so with him, I worked on really, really very complex music, very simple music. We did, what did I do with him? I did When Lights Are Low, but I also worked on the Gershwin Concerto in F, and that was my recital piece. I did my whole version of it, all movements, solo piano. And I really worked on this concept. And so if we fast forward to 2013, I developed my hard listening concept. And my hard listening concept was all solo piano based, except I thought, I'm going to use things from popular music. And I'm going to have the popular music figures, stock footage is what they would say in cinema. Almost cliches. I would have that be the raw material for the entire music. And it was an experiment, I thought, and then I'm going to put it in a kind of a kaleidoscope, like a collage mosaic, a modular mosaic. And that's why I got the idea. That's when I wrote Feminist Singer-Songwriter Without Words. And I wrote it for my first hard listening album. I'm going to play a little bit of it. And it was later used in the movie Support the Girls for Andrew Bajowski. He contacted me, says, your song has to be in the credit sequence in my movie. And, that was very different because I was listening. So I did a lot of research for that piece. And it's like an 11-minute piece. And I, stopped listening to jazz for about a month or so, which is really hard, man. It's hard for me to stop listening to Cedar Walton, And I bought this book. And I read this book. And I said, I'm really into the 70s. I'm going to write this piece and I'm going to just do nothing but listen to Carol Kane, Laura Nyro, Joni Mitchell, Carol Bayer Sager, Carly Simon. I'm just going to listen to that. Now, here's what's really interesting. Wouldn't you know it? The first girl I was ever intimate with in Boston was a Suzanne Vega fanatic. And we would get together on dates and things, and there would always be "My Name is Luca" in the background. I think this would have been 1987. And so I really liked the Suzanne Vega. I never followed up on it, never influenced anything I wrote. I really like that album. I like those songs. Until 2013, when I thought, I got to get back and listen to this music. And so my idea was to do like a Schumann song without words, or Schubert for piano, like in concert piano. I said, what would it be like if I did a 9-minute concert piece using this women's music, this kind of folk kind of thing as the language, but then get into Charles Ives and things like that about it, or even Bill Evans. I'll show you what I mean. So I had this all music is language, and there's different languages. So this I got the roll on the strings. There's a certain kind of language. It's one. That's a language. If I do this, that's a language all of its own, with its own emotions and colors and meanings and things, right? This is a language. That's a language. All different languages, and I, over the years I've been trying to learn different languages and get better, but I was kind of interested in this long title piece, Feminist Singer-Songwriter, with this kind of language. I thought, well, I'm going to do this. I'm purposefully not playing that piece. I'm altering slightly because I'm trying to express the language rather than the piece, if that makes any sense at all. And so I got this idea, Peace, Bill Evans. What if I did that 2-chord thing, but using Carol Kane and their language? That's what I did. So you know, because the way, you know, I'm a tonality guy. I like tonality. But when I venture away or when I get more chromatic, I get more dissonant. It's for good reason. And like a piece like this, you can really, it's kind of interesting, interesting coloristic thing. And so all this stuff I've been doing, that piece, even piece I'm writing now, like I'll tell you what, I play the first few measures of this string quintet or piano quintet. So maybe it might inspire somebody out there who want to do it, violinists. But I'm becoming more and more interested now with really, really letting the sound and the harmony shine through. Elongation, more and more. A fidelity to the sound, fidelity to the moment. I'm very interested in that. And kind of my own kind of minimalism. I mean, you know, it's not, I respect, you know, look, I used to go see Philip Glass play in the 80s. I used to watch him in Bowling Green, Ohio. I watched his band and just, you know, I would watch those cats and like, wow. But, you know, my thing is, you know, I'm interested in the idea of repetition. I'm getting more into that, you know, and so, very important. Forgot something. You know, when I do one of these things, I'm always going to forget something. I'm always going to say, oh, what about this with this? The Copland Clarinet Concerto. Is it too low? Copland was very, very interested in that same thing. He was really interested in kind of devotion to that moment, and not a lot of filler, editing, cutting things out, and getting to the essence of a thing. And you know, when you got harmony like that, I mean, but you know, he's working with that same, you know. We'll do that. Yeah. So I thought I would open up my string quintet. When I come in. That's the feeling of this movement. Now, now we're talking about composing music, because then you got these issues. So if I start off a piece like that, you got a couple questions, all right? How long am I going to do it? Go on like that? Am I going to interrupt it? I think music should have dramatic contrast. I think everything in life that's artistic, that's created, aesthetic should have contrast in it, And so I'm not going to reveal today how I did that, but I've got even in this piece, I'm doing. So I'm still using. I'm using. Because I'm interested in. It's an experiment. So what would happen if you took, I say take out the stuffing of the music, and you just had just the bare bone harmony of something? What would that be interesting? And I'm also creating, you hear I'm using, that's Burt Bacharach. I have that in here. I have On a Clear Day You Can See Forever. I mean, not literally. I know it's not plagiarism, but it's and then I have the second movement of this is dedicated to Stanley Cowell. There's so much I could say about him as a teacher, but I've already said enough, I'm sure. But it all kind of ties together to me. So this is the latest thing I'm done. But this dramatic contrast thing, like I've got something I'm working on right now. That's unrelated to these other things, but I'm always working on stuff. And so my ears, through all these decades, I was working on my ears because my ears were weak and my ears were slow. And they're better now than they were, when I was that kid who couldn't pick out things on the piano. And that's just worked, and it all really comes back, I think, to if you love something enough. You got to love what you're doing. I love everything I've been talking about. I love all this stuff. I can't, it's a very aesthetic experience, because it's not really about, I'm not interested, like when I went into music, I wasn't interested in the non-musical things it could do for me, like fame or riches or any of that. I just love the music. I just wanted to be able to contribute to this thing that was to me so valuable. And that's it. And I think really, I think that's a better consideration than other considerations. I guess you could, people on my podcast talk about a lot of reasons about why they do things, and it's interesting. You listen to them, and they're all, of course, valid for those people, and all that. But I think if you have a love for just that, you'll be well on your way. If you have a love for that, you can love that. If you have a love for, I don't know, whatever it is, or And I almost want to say the rest will follow. It's not quite that simple, but it's close to being that simple, I think, you know. And you know, all those people I was in awe of that can have this perfect pitch, like my teacher, you know, they have a different life experience. Well, first of all, they're not autistic. You know, that's another thing too. My autism is like I'm laying on my back listening to this music, you know, and it's a different way to relate to music, you know, and it's a different, you know. I was reading it as soon as I was conscious, you know, learn to read, just reading books. I got all these books. I'm reading film magazines, you know, but I'm just a little slow picking out a melody, you know. What time is it? How long have I been talking? It's almost 6. That's an hour. I don't know what else to say. I think I'll go out with a little music and then we'll leave something for part 2 because I'm going to get into some other things. All right. I don't know. Have a good weekend, everybody.